Okay, I think we're ready.
I'm starting it right now, yes.
Okay, good evening everyone. I'm Kevin Kenny, I'm the director of Glucksman Ireland House, and welcome to the first and coldest event in our spring calendar. Our speaker this evening is Professor Lucy Salyer from the University of New Hampshire. Lucy and I first met in Boston. We were only just chatting about how warm the winter weather is down here, but it seems to have taken a turn downwards. Professor Salyer is one of the leading historians of immigration and citizenship in the United States. Her first book, Laws Harsh as Tigers, demonstrated how legal and social battles over Chinese immigration in the late 19th and early 20th century gave rise to the current immigration system, in which the nation state exercises a near absolute sovereign power to exclude and deport, with the executive and legislative branches largely immune from judicial review. So that's clearly a topic of compelling interest today. It's known in other words as the plenary power doctrine, which was the basis of the tribal ban that the Supreme Court upheld last year. This evening we have the pleasure of launching Professor Salyer's second book, Under the Starry Flag, How a Band of Irish Americans Joined the Fenian Revolt and Sparked a Crisis over Citizenship. The book is here, just published by Harvard's Trade Division, the Belknap Press. We'll have a reception downstairs after the talk, and books will be available for signing. Under the Starry Flag is a brilliant piece of historical writing. It tells the story of a dramatic incident in international history, the voyage of the Erins Hope, with 40 Irish Americans on board intending to participate in a rebellion in Ireland in the 1860s. It uses that story as a window onto important issues in 19th century American history. Because of its story, the book is a real page-turner, but it conveys profound insights about important historical issues, organized around the key question of the right, or otherwise, of immigrants to cast off their prior allegiance through expatriation, and the manipulation of that question by states in the realm of international law and diplomacy. So the incident in question, as Professor Salyer reveals, triggered a crisis in Anglo-American relations that led the United States to articulate a formal policy in this arena. A small group of Irish nationalists stand at the heart of the story, but it's a story involving domestic and international politics at the highest level. Before I spoil any more of the story, I will turn the podium over to Lucy Salyer.
I hope that's recorded, because it was such a nice summary synopsis of the book. It's always difficult to sum up one's own book, so thank you so much. Well, thank you for coming out. If it's any consolation, my husband and I, when we left yesterday from New Hampshire, had to shovel 8 inches of snow just to get to the bus on time. So it's cold, and I'm very appreciative that you're here tonight. I wanted to thank Miriam for all of her help. I know she's over there somewhere, but thank you for helping set up all the logistics for this visit. And a huge thanks to Kevin Kenny. Long ago, he agreed to have coffee with me at Boston College when I was just beginning this research and had no clue what I was doing in terms of going to Ireland and using those sources, and he brought along Hide Hirota, his student, and they taught me all kinds of wonderful things about the archives and taught me how to pronounce Irish names, and I still don't know how to do that very well, so if I make mistakes, let me know. But he has been a steadfast supporter ever since, and I deeply appreciate all his help along the way. So I'm really happy, books take so long and you don't get a chance to talk about them as much as you would like. So it's lovely to be here to share a little bit about my new book, Under the Starry Flag. So as Kevin suggested, the book tells the tale of Irish freedom fighters who formed the Fenian Brotherhood in 1859 with one singular goal in mind. As one of them said, it was to, quote, revolutionize Ireland. In other words, they wanted to drive England out of Ireland and to establish a free Irish republic. This is not the story I set out to tell many years ago. I am not an expert in Irish American history or Irish history. I have become a lot more knowledgeable. Hopefully, I'll have convinced you that I've learned some things along the way. What I started out to research was the history of citizenship policies. And I was going to do a grand history beginning with Reconstruction right after the Civil War and going to the present. And then I stumbled across the story of the Fenians. And so I ditched the other project and decided this would be a lot more fun to write. And for a couple of reasons. One reason is I really wanted to try my hand at writing narrative history. History that had a good story to tell, that maybe my friends and family might actually read and get through. My husband's halfway through it, so maybe he'll finish. But also I wanted to write something my students could read, but that had some heft to it. So a good story that had analytical points. It turned out to be a lot harder than I expected to do. But it also turned out the Fenians were actually, they had a lot to do with a forgotten chapter of American citizenship policy. So it was fortuitous. They had a great story. It was actually linked to my original topic. And the basic point of the book, in a nutshell, is this. The Fenians failed to free Ireland, at least in the short run, but they did spark a revolution in the law of citizenship. And that is true not only domestically within the United States, but internationally. So that's the big argument. And another reason why the Fenian story hooked my interest relates to another big theme of the book. And that is the importance of looking at immigration and citizenship policies from a global perspective. I think we tend to talk about U.S. immigration policies with national blinders on. We think about them as purely domestic debates, as we can see in today's furious battles over the border. But migration and citizenship policies, they're affecting people who move across national borders. And there's much to be gained by broadening our frame and by using a wider lens to understand how these policies connect across national borders. And that's what I hope to show you a bit tonight to persuade you of. So the story I tell is in some ways very local. The Erins Hope gun running expedition starts a few blocks down on East Broadway and Canal Street. That's where the men gather to nonchalantly saunter down Canal Street and board a boat that takes them to the Jacmel, and they begin their boat ride to Ireland. So in some ways it's a very local story, but it's also a story that takes us to Ireland, to England, Prussia, France, and even China. So the book is a pitch for what's been called local history, right? The marriage of local and global. So that's the big picture. Well, let me begin just by talking a little bit about the Fenians, and I imagine almost everybody in this room probably knows who the Fenians were, but just in case, let me just say a little bit about who they were and what their plan was. So, as I've already suggested, or it's been hinted at, the Fenian Brotherhood was a transatlantic organization. The major homes, they were in the United States and in Ireland, but it also spread with the Irish diaspora as well. So the estimates vary widely about the membership. It could be as many as 250,000 members. Many more probably sympathized with the organization if they weren't actual members. Many had been born in Ireland, and that's true of my main character, John Warren, on the left here. John Warren was sort of, I use him to illustrate who the kind of mid-level typical Fenian was, right? So he was born in Clonakilty in County Cork. He was born to a family of artisans, so they were skilled workers. And he comes of age during the Irish famine. He leaves Ireland in 1853 when he's about 18 or 19 years old, and he goes to Boston. So that's a fairly typical profile in some ways. Many also, on the right is an image that's one of the iconic images from the Great Famine. It is called Women Begging at Clonakilty. It's one of the images that was widely seen through the Illustrated London News. So the other feature of typical characteristic of the Fenians were many were Civil War veterans. They came to the United States. Many became naturalized citizens, as did John Warren. They became citizens through naturalization. And many fought in the Civil War, mostly for the Union side. And this turned out to be, they saw their service both as a service to the United States. They were great devotees of the United States as this great republic, but they also saw it as a practical training ground for the war ahead. The next war would be with England after the war was over. So they would gain military know-how and they used their time in the army to start organizing. So by 1865, the Fenian Brotherhood was kind of at its peak, I would guess, and had some momentum growing. They had purchased this beautiful Moffat mansion on Union Square, the other few blocks north, and they had created their own government, in essence. They had a president, a senate, they had a secretary of war, and they had a Fenian army. They also had adopted a flag, which looks kind of familiar. There are many different Fenian flags. This is one of several, but you can see it's a stars and stripes, although green and white. There are 32 stars, one for each county in Ireland. And if you look at the constitution of the Fenian Brotherhood, it has a very familiar ring. Its preamble begins, "We, the members of the Fenian Brotherhood, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, and ensure domestic tranquility," etc., etc. So these symbols really capture a key aspect of the Fenian Brotherhood, that they very much see themselves as Americans and as Irish, joined together by this Republican tradition. So that's a little bit overview about who they are. What did they do? The Fenian Brotherhood believed that Ireland could only be liberated by physical force. They agreed on that. They disagreed on tactics. One wing thought the best strategy was to invade Canada. And I came to this whole thing not knowing anything, and I thought, this is crazy. Why would they invade Canada? One idea is that they thought, well, they are also oppressed by the British. They will welcome us, and we will join forces. And it turned out the Canadians did not welcome them. They felt invaded, and unjustly so. But the more savvy bit of the strategy was that really what they wanted to do was to create a diplomatic rupture between the United States and Britain. And with the hope that if the United States and Britain came to blows, that Ireland would become free as a byproduct. And that was not as crazy as it might sound, right? At the end of the Civil War, relations between the United States and Britain were very strained, largely because many Americans felt that England had unduly favored the South, that it had shown too much sympathy for the Confederacy, and especially they were really, really angry about that England allowed Confederate raiders to be built in English ports like the Alabama, which did tremendous damage to the Union Navy and to Northern merchant ships and in the North's view along the war. So at the end of the Civil War, there's already a lot of chatter and newspaper articles that there might be a war between the United States and Britain. And so the Fenians think, well, we just give that a little bit more of a nudge and maybe there will be a war. So that's one plan, is to invade Canada, and indeed there are 3 invasions in Canada in 1866 in the summer. And this map shows the battle plan. The first invasion you don't really see here. It's through Maine, through Eastport, Maine into New Brunswick. The second invasion was through Buffalo, New York into the Niagara frontier. And the third is through St. Albans, Vermont into Quebec. All of these are dismal failures. The most successful was the second invasion into the Niagara frontier from Buffalo. And the Fenian invaders last a couple of days. They end up killing 9 Canadians, 3 of whom were poor students from the University of Toronto who were called up during finals to serve. The battle did not look anything like this. It was, they did not have nice uniforms, and it was more of a guerrilla warfare sort of situation. But this shows a victorious Fenian brigade, which was far from the truth. It was a failure militarily. It did gain a lot of publicity. So that was one of the hopes. The other branch are the ones I focus on. Instead of invading Canada, other Fenians said, we should just go to Ireland and create a rebellion. And that's what happened with the Erins Hope. It begins, its name in the beginning is Jack Mill, and it was a very sorry-looking brigantine that the Fenians found. It's a little bit unclear how they got this boat. These 40 guys show up and meet at this house on East Broadway and Canal Street, and they travel on Erins Hope to Ireland. So these are, almost all of them are Civil War veterans, and in the hold of the boat there are about 5,000 revolvers and rifles, 1.5 million rounds of ammunition, and 3 pieces of artillery. So the goal, why are they going now with all these guns, is on March 5th, 1867, the long-awaited rising breaks out in Ireland. The Fenians had been plotting this for a very long time, and it finally erupts on March 5th, 1867. So this is a kind of a guerrilla warfare situation where there are attacks on military installations, telegraph lines are ripped up, as are railroad lines. The goal is to try to hold Dublin, to seize Dublin, and to hold it until reinforcements come from the United States. That's where Erins Hope comes in. They are some of the reinforcements that are bringing arms and men. So things go really great for about a week as they leave New York City. And on Easter Day, Easter Sunday, they stop to dedicate their mission. They rename the boat Erins Hope, and they're on their way. Unfortunately, when they finally get to Ireland, you can see here's where they land. They land off the west coast of Sligo, and they've been told to go there to deliver their arms to the waiting rebels. When they get there, they find the rising has been put down. It's over. And they say, why don't you go down to the south? There still might be some rebel activity down there. So they sail down across to the southern coast. By this point, the expedition is really in a shambles. They barely have enough food and water. The men are getting mutinous. So the leaders, one of whom is John Warren, who we saw earlier, say, well, let's just land here and see if we can find some help. Maybe we can find some people to give these arms to. So they land on the southern coast near Dungarvan in County Waterford. And they're immediately scooped up and arrested by the Coast Guard, which has been looking for people just like them ever since the rising. This is current day near Dungarvan, where the Coast Guard station was. I'm not sure if I guess it was. But it's a lovely spot, and there is like a little monument there for Erins Hope. It looks very sorry. It doesn't look to me like anybody ever goes to visit it. So if you ever go, you can go see it, and you'll know the story behind it. So they're arrested, and they're put into Kilmainham Jail, the famous political prison in Dublin. And you would think that's the end of the story. But for me, it's the beginning of the story. Because as they become prisoners and as they become tried for treason, that's when this huge international controversy breaks out. And let me catch up with my notes. Even though the Fenians are unsuccessful in freeing Ireland, they're tremendously successful in kicking up this diplomatic fuss. And it's all over something called the Right of Expatriation. Right? If your mind has gone blank, Kevin kind of gave you a quick description of what that means. But if you think, what is the Right of Expatriation, you're in good company, because most people don't know what it is. And I learned this the hard way when I would tell people, I'm working on the history of the Right of Expatriation, and I would get big blank looks. And so now I call it the forgotten right of expatriation. And one of the questions in the book is, why has it become forgotten? So, just to make sure we're on the same page, what is the right of expatriation? It is basically the right to leave your native land, to migrate, and to decide to become a citizen somewhere else. The right to give up your allegiance to Britain and to become a naturalized citizen of the United States. Every year, thousands of people become American citizens. They are exercising when they go in the naturalization ceremonies, and when they renounce their citizenship or allegiance to their former sovereigns, and they swear allegiance to a new one. They are exercising their right of expatriation, but I'm pretty sure that nobody says, I'm exercising my right of expatriation. It doesn't have a lot of saliency now. But so one of the big, I think one of the fascinating questions is that in the 19th century, everybody knew what the right of expatriation was, and they talked about it in glowing terms. They would call it, for example, a natural right bestowed upon us by, bestowed on man by his creator. They called it as sacred a right, as inalienable as the rights of persons and of property, the liberty of speech and religion. So it's one of those fundamental human rights, natural rights, that we all have. And it's this right that becomes the spark that ignites this controversy between the United States and Britain, but also between the United States and many other European countries. So how does that happen? When the Fenians invade Canada and when they show up in Ireland, it's not surprising they're arrested, right? They are arrested and then they're charged with treason. The Irish-American Fenians are furious. They say, we're not British subjects, we're American citizens. We rejected our Britishness and we swore our allegiance to the United States, and we demand diplomatic protection by the United States. The British respond in a way that always infuriates Americans. They just say, well, once a subject, always a subject. In other words, this is this theory of perpetual allegiance. They said to the Irish Americans, you can, no matter where you go, you were born in Ireland under British jurisdiction, and no matter where you go, no matter how many oaths of allegiance you take elsewhere, you're always going to be a British subject. Only death can free you from your allegiance. Now, this doctrine of perpetual allegiance had been, once a subject, always a subject. This had been a thorn in the side of Americans ever since the American Revolution. And if you think about it, expatriation is quite literally a revolutionary doctrine. Right? So when Americans declared their independence from Britain, they, in effect, were performing a mass act of expatriation. We reject being subjects. We are now going to be called something citizens, American citizens. And this really introduced powerful new ideas of citizenship. Right? The British say you have no choice. Americans embrace this idea of volitional allegiance. rights. We have the right to choose who we want to swear our allegiance to, and that's what you see here in this this image. We owe allegiance to no crown. And in this image, in this idea of volitional allegiance, being able to choose, the naturalized American becomes in many ways the model American, because they actively chose, they thought about it, they actively chose to become citizens. So these two conflicting notions of membership, perpetual allegiance and volitional allegiance, they weren't just theoretical differences. It's not something people talk about in philosophy, coffee houses. They had real life consequences for migrants as they traveled across borders and jurisdictions. And they had real life consequences for governments as they're trying to assert control over their territorial boundaries. And these conflicts between countries over these different memberships could also result in war, and they did in 1812, the War of 1812. We know the textbook description of the causes of the War of 1812, and one of them is the impressment, the British impressing American sailors, going on boats and plucking them off the ships. But what's important to remember is that the British aren't just plucking anybody. They are plucking naturalized American citizens, most often Irish Americans. So these are people who had been born under British jurisdiction, had left and become American citizens. They are being targeted. And the British use this idea of once a subject, always a subject, saying you owe your allegiance to the king. He needs you now. We need you in the king's navy. The American government is furious, saying, no, they're American citizens. And this is one of the causes of the War of 1812. The war ends, but the battle over expatriation does not. It's not really resolved. And in fact, the conflict between governments gets worse. It continues to simmer and to flare up, especially between after 1840, as you have the beginning of modern mass migration. You see the chart on the left shows this big peak in the number of migrants coming to the United States. Between 1840 and 1860, 4.5 million immigrants or so come to the United States. 70% are from Ireland and Germany. And as the migrants travel back and forth across borders, they raise a question, as one Irish American put it: which country owns us? To whom do we belong? European countries are seeing their residents leave in the thousands and millions, and in the 18th and early 19th century, European governments see their people as resources, not unlike timber or fish, right? These are really important resources if a government is going to thrive. They provide the labor, reproductive forces, and most important, they provide the soldiers, right? the armed forces that they count on to be powerful. So, up until the mid-19th century, they kept a tight hold on their migrants to a certain extent. So this is another way in which the book really tries to shift our attention. Today, if you've been following the government shutdown over the wall, today the whole debate is over keeping people out, right? How do governments regulate entry? In the 19th century, it was about regulating exits, keeping people from leaving. That was the biggest issue. So for German states, this was particularly difficult. If you were leaving Prussia, for example, you had to get an exit permit. And to get an exit permit, you had to say, I've paid my tithes, I've paid off my debts, and I've fulfilled my military service. And then you had to pay a big fee to get an exit permit. And then you had to endure a lecture. They would tell you were being foolish for leaving. And then you might be able to get your permit. And so many just slipped away unlawfully. They became unlawful immigrants with an E, or undocumented immigrants with an E. But then when they come back, when German Americans go home to visit or to start up a business, as many did after the Civil War, they might find themselves in prison for having left unlawfully, or they might find themselves in the military. So these practices this division between, this difference between the U.S. and other governments put them on a collision course, these governments on a collision course. And they put immigrants in a difficult bind. In this, immigrants want to secure better futures for themselves and to be free of the onerous demands of their governments. Francis Lieber articulates this immigrant's point of view. He's also really important in the book because you might have heard of him because he wrote the Code of War during the Civil War. But he also is a pioneering international lawyer who does a great deal to help persuade governments to recognize the right of expatriation. So he's an international law scholar, but he's also an immigrant himself. And he escapes Prussia and comes to the United States. And he says this in response to government saying you can't leave. He says, if overpopulation or overtaxation grind down a man so that he can barely obtain food for his family, shall he linger out a life of wretchedness? Obviously the answer is no. He should be able to go. And so he and other migrants insisted that they had a right to go wherever they could to secure a better life, a right to migrate. So this is just to show you this lots of things, big changes going on in the world, global shifts of people, different interests of states, and a bubbling controversy. And this is the international controversy that the Fenians are stepping into. And they know it, right? They're very savvy about where to push on these buttons and how to use this age-old controversy to help create a fuss or create a diplomatic crisis. So they make very dramatic use of their imprisonment. Somehow they're able to smuggle out letters and newspaper articles. And so there are lots of articles about their life in prison with headlines like Life in the Bastille. They are writing piles of letters and petitions to their families, to their friends, but especially to politicians, to Secretary of State Seward, and to Congress. And especially they're writing to Charles Francis Adams. And there's a nice little irony here because his father, John Quincy Adams, the president, had been the one to try to resolve the issue of expatriation with the War of 1812 unsuccessfully. And now this issue's back on his son's plate. Adams had been, he was the U.S. minister to England during the Civil War and during the Fenian crisis. And he was really not happy to hear from the Fenians. He was not very sympathetic, especially as they quickly became a diplomatic nightmare. By the time the Fenians come, Adams had been in London for 6 years, very long years. As early as 1864, he's writing letters to Seward saying, please let me come home. He writes in his diary, I have utterly lost interest in anything here in 1865, for if I remain, it will probably be to spend more time in solitude. 2.5 years later, he's still in London, and now the Erins Hope men have shown up, and they've created a new fuss. He had worked so very hard during the Civil War to keep Britain out of the war. That was his main objective, but also to keep Britain and the United States at peace. And when the war's over, he thinks, finally I get to go home. And then the Fenians come and ruin everything. And he has very little sympathy for these Irish freedom fighters who he thinks are selfish and dragging the United States into a bloody mess just to secure their own selfish ends. He would complain in 1868 when he finally writes to Seward saying, I really quit. I mean it now, I'm resigning. And he says, I find myself doing nothing but reclaiming Irishmen from punishment, which most of them seem to me richly to deserve. So the tipping point in this controversy comes with the trials of the Erins Hope men, and particularly the trial of John Warren. This is his trial for treason. And Warren, he prides himself on being a military man, but as the journalists who go to see him at the trial say, well, he doesn't really look like a soldier. They call him squat, very stout. He's balding. But if he's not necessarily, you know, that kind of a warrior, he's definitely a warrior with the pen. He's got a gift of gab and a very powerful rhetoric, and he's had his own newspaper, the Fenian Spirit, which there's a whole run of it in the archives at the National Archives in Dublin, and we need to get copies of it here. We don't have, but there's one extant issue that I've been able to find in the United States. This is a treasure trove. But anyway, so he knows how to write, and he knows he's a provocateur, and he is determined to use his trial as best he can to cause a big fuss, and he does. He turns his trial for treason into a trial against the British. So he says, my case is your case. He's talking to the Americans, saying, you know, I'm on trial, but it's really America that's on trial. He says, what's at stake in this trial? Only America's honor and power in the world. And his key question to the American people, all of this is being heavily covered in the newspapers, and it's republished in the Congressional Record and in other newspapers. So he says, what's at stake here is America's honor and power in the world. Is the United States going to let Britain decide who is and who is not an American citizen? The British say yes. They're going to decide, not the United States. He is found guilty, and this is the courthouse, the Green Street Courthouse in Dublin. At his sentencing hearing, Warren makes sure that the point gets thrust home. He says under British law, not only were those born in Britain perpetual subjects, but so too were their children and grandchildren. So he's trying to warn Americans of British overreaching. He says, by British law, General Washington and Benjamin Franklin lived and died British subjects, and you could hang the whole of them if convicted of high treason. What's also very savvy about Warren is, so first of all, he's claiming that he's trying to create this international controversy. But he's also really speaking to a domestic crisis as well. He says what's at stake also is American honor at home. Were Americans going to honor their obligation to protect naturalized citizens as well as native-born citizens when they get in trouble abroad? And this quickly becomes a focus, a question as other Erins Hope men, when the news breaks about how they're being treated. So Warren was a naturalized American citizen. He is convicted of treason. He is sentenced to 15 years at hard labor. But the co-commander is on the Erins Hope, William Nagel, was born in New York to Irish parents. So he is a native-born American citizen. He is set free, and he sails home. And there's a longer story, but that's the upshot. When he is set free, the Irishman newspaper has this big headline, "He is set free." And this is not written in glee, it's written in consternation. How can that be? How can he go free while Warren suffers and sits in jail? Well, how this plays out at home is that it's yet another example of how the foreign-born in the United States are second-class citizens. So even as the Fenians are stepping into an international controversy that had been brewing for years, they're also stepping into a domestic controversy that had been brewing for years over the status of foreign-born Americans. As millions, I'm sure this is a familiar story to many of you as well, as millions of immigrants show up in the United States in the 1840s and 1850s, they encounter a decidedly mixed reception, right? They're welcomed for their labor, but by the 1850s, anti-immigrant sentiment had been whipped up into such a furor, it had become quite a political force with the Know Nothing movement and the formation of the American Party. And this particularly took aim at Irish and Germans, and particularly against Catholics, who were seen as undermining all that was good about America. There are some echoes in today's discussions. So By 1867, know-nothingism had died down, right? And with, especially when the foreign-born served in the army. Know-nothingism had died down, but anti-Irish sentiment and anti-immigrant sentiment still lingered, and it popped up in these sorts of cartoons by Thomas Nast, with Irish still being portrayed as apes, and in snarky comments about the Irish character. So Warren's conviction, in conjunction with Nagel's release, strikes a nerve among the foreign-born. The president of the Fenian Brotherhood would sum it up with a simple question. Are naturalized Americans Americans, he asks. Are we going to be treated like everybody else or not? And Warren stokes that fire. He's in jail, but he's still writing letters home and saying, speaking to the foreign-born. He says, you built America. You saved it during the Civil War. And indeed, that the veterans of the Civil War are quite adamant that they should be receiving more accolades for their service. The song written during the Civil War said, speaking from the immigrant point of view, we are citizens twice over, by the law and by the sword. They're citizens because they've sworn their allegiance, but also because they've defended their country. And yet, they say we get no respect. Right? So this is a kind of a simmering discontent that really gets fueled by the Fenian trials and how it's playing out. And it also is really fueled by this Reconstruction-era context. So following Civil War, we have Reconstruction, which was this time of incredible change, defining citizenship for the first time with the 14th Amendment, for example, the passage of Civil Rights Acts. And so citizenship is really being debated. You know, who is a citizen? What rights do citizens have? Many foreign-born, European foreign-born, believe that Congress isn't really concerned about them, right? That they're so busy passing these Civil Rights Acts and these amendments, but who are they really concerned about? African Americans, not the European foreign-born. And this is a message that George Francis Train really brings home. Here's another, I met so many interesting characters in finding this and doing the research, and he was one of the surprises. He was an incredibly popular speaker. I don't know if you've heard of him before. I'm surprised he's not better known. He was really a popular speaker. In part, not unlike some people today, some politicians and speakers, is because he would say the darndest things, right? He just was really out there in what he would say, and people would just come because they wanted to hear what crazy stuff he would say. One newspaper reporter said he had diarrhea of the mouth, because things just spewed out. But he was really popular, and he packed audiences, and he was a favored speaker for various crowds. And in 1867, which I found fascinating, he had two main, he was stumping for two main causes. One is women's suffrage. He works with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony to push women's suffrage. The other big cause is the Fenian Brotherhood, and he is a favored speaker. At the rally, he goes to speak for a rally for John Warren's family in Boston, and he was very popular. He draws huge applause. But listen to his speech and how he's pitching this cause. He says, "Where is Charles Sumner, the great Reconstruction reformer? Where are your members of Congress? As usual, moaning and groaning over the blacks. White men are not citizens. Irishmen have no rights your congressional delegation are bound to respect." So those of you familiar with the Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott, will see the allusion to that decision. But here he really plays into the politics of racial resentment. And that also is pushing this cause further. European foreign-born feel it's not just immigrants that are being left in the cold, but especially white immigrant men that are being left out of the equation. One German-American businessman and journalist would say, "Is it right that the educated German, who shed his blood for the Union and for the abolition of slavery, should stand beneath the ignorant Negro whom he helped to liberate from bondage? So there are many strands feeding into the ultimate victory of the right of expatriation. By December of 1867, expatriation had become the issue of the hour, both at home but also abroad. Within weeks of Warren's conviction in Dublin, the Boston Pilot is reporting there are immense and enthusiastic meetings being held throughout the nation. And they're drawing not only Irish Americans, but Poles, Germans, Austrians, and others who had made America their home. And here's just a placard announcing this mass meeting and some of their slogans. We demand our rights as citizens. And also what's happening, which I don't have time to talk about, but it's also part of the book, is the work that diplomats and international law scholars are doing. They're in a sort of a separate group who is also very interested in securing free migration and the right of expatriation. And they're busily writing articles and trying to persuade their home governments that they would be better off by changing their rules of membership and acknowledging the right to leave. So it succeeds. On July 27th, 1868, one day before the 14th Amendment is ratified, the expatriation is passed by Congress after a very long debate. And it declares, quote, the right of expatriation is a natural and inherent right of all people. And it committed the government to protect, to extend to naturalized citizens the same protection of persons and property that is accorded to native born. So they have to treat them the same when they run into trouble abroad. It did not include a hostages provision, which the Fenian supporters wanted, which they wanted, like, if it's sort of what's been happening in recent news, that if the British arrest an Irish American, then the United States would arrest some random British subject and hold them as hostage until theirs are released. So they didn't pass that. Even more striking, the U.S. negotiated naturalization treaties with a dozen countries between 1868 and 1872. Most importantly, with several German states and with Great Britain. And this was important because they were the home to the bulk of immigrants coming to the United States. So this is a really important shift. Great Britain is finally giving up their Perpetual Allegiance doctrine. And they, along with other European governments, are saying, okay, fine, you can leave, you can renounce your citizenship or subjectship, and you can become a citizen somewhere else. And John Warren and the other prisoners get to come home in the spring of 1869 as these laws and treaties are being signed. So, what do we make of all this? Many Americans celebrated these treaties and this law. They would call it, quote, they would call it one of the greatest and most important triumphs of American democracy. And if you think about it, the right of expatriation really is bold and revolutionary. If you think about it broadly, it's affirming a natural right to migration. And strikingly, it's not the, let me see. All right, well, I think the slides got out of order. Strikingly, in 1948, the United Nations will, in its Universal Declaration of Rights, will explicitly affirm that everybody has the right to leave, to exit their countries, and everybody has the right to change their nationality. So 80 years after the expatriation crisis, we have this ringing endorsement of the right of expatriation. But here's the question. So it seems like it's a success. The right of expatriation is secured, it's recognized. But why has it become a forgotten right? Why is it invisible to us? Why don't we still think about it as, when I ask my legal history students, what rights do we have just by virtue of being people? No one has ever said the right of of expatriation, would never occur to anybody. So why has it become invisible? and this is heading towards my conclusion. One answer might just be that it seems obvious that people should be able to change their allegiance, that it's no longer an issue for us today, so it's just obvious, so we don't think about it much. But I think there's something more going on with that, and I think more broadly that the right of expatriation has disappeared from view because this right to migrate, which was championed in the 19th century, soon ran headlong into state control over borders and the perceived right of nations to police their borders and keep people out. And it's striking that in 1868 we had the Expatriation Act. Not even 20 years later, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act, and which forbade the further migration of Chinese laborers, and this policy will get expanded and will be in place until 1942. So even, or 43, even in 1868, when expatriation was reaching its height, it was already limited in some ways. It was constrained by state interests, but also by restricted definitions of who belonged. Recall those racial arguments of George Francis Train. They defined expatriation as the right of white men. And the policies of the United States showed that race would continue to restrict immigration, both with the Chinese Exclusion Act and as immigration restriction expands and culminates with the Code Act of 1924, we are introduced to a really basic flaw in the right of expatriation. As you can see here with this cartoon, the Chinese immigrant sitting outside the Gate of Liberty, you see on the left that the United States will admit communists, nihilists, socialists, Fenians, and hoodlums, but not the Chinese. So the fatal flaw is this: you might have the right to exit, but that does not mean you have the right to enter. And if you don't have the right to enter, what good is the right of exit, right? So it's this little bit of a conundrum. At the time in 1868, one commentator would say about the Expatriation Act, he would praise it. He would say, everybody has a right to denationalize himself and to expatriate and to become a citizen of another country. And then there was the but, provided, of course, that country consents to receive him. No country is prepared to have citizens poured into it like water into a bucket, he said, but prefers rather that they should come through some sort of filter. And the filter for citizenship then, and for much of American history, reflected many of the same racial and gender hierarchies that structured other civil and political rights. So, in sum, what I argue is that the right of expatriation and the right of migration, so celebrated as a natural right in the 19th century, has largely become overshadowed by restrictive immigration regimes in the 20th and 21st centuries. So immigrants and refugees continue today to become ensnared in domestic and international disputes, and I would argue the right of expatriation has not actually been secured. It remains more of an aspiration than a fact. So thank you for your kind attention, and I'm happy to take questions if you have them. Yes?
Why do you think Britain agreed to end the perpetual citizenship?
Britain?
Yeah.
It's a great question. Mainly because I think they were convinced it was no longer in their interest to do so. It is a hard sell for a lot of people, right? But in the parliamentary debates, and in lots of the writings that lead up to those parliamentary debates, do you need me to be at the? Really, there are a few different arguments. One is, look, this rule of perpetual allegiance might have made sense in feudal times when people didn't travel, right? You were on your lord's land, and it made sense, right? But with an era of mass migration, as people are going back and forth, times have changed. That's the argument of
Sir Harcourt, who is a leading international law scholar, and he's really saying, you need new policies for new times. So what these international law scholars are really trying to tell governments is that, look, we have this time of great excitement. This is the time where international trade is flowing, and there's a free flow of people and goods. And so they're really making sort of the classical liberal argument that it's better for people and better for governments if people can come and go, responding to supply and demand, and that will be better for everybody. And then the second issue is just like, do you really want these guys? These Fenians are a pain in the neck, and they're working the system. And the harder do you want to hold on to people who really don't want to be part of your country? So they were admitting that, they're doing nothing to stopping them from leaving. And Britain didn't, unlike Germany, didn't stop them from leaving. So it really seemed there were so many issues that Britain and the United States were at odds with. It was not just the Fenians and expatriation, it was the Alabama, they were still discussing, is Britain going to pay for the damage caused by Alabama? They have fisheries disputes, they have border disputes. And Seward says, the Secretary of State says, if you give us this one, then we'll talk to you about these other issues. But we're not doing anything until you resolve the expatriation issue. So it's a complicated answer, it's both about sort of a vision of where the world is in terms of the economy and migration, but it's also pragmatic decision-making about how to move forward on a more even keel with the United States.
It might be best for the audio feed. I'm not sure.
Okay, sorry.
I don't
Thanks.
know.
All right, Kevin.
I think what's interesting, looking at this, is the degree to which it's a one-sided street. I think in one of his books, Neil Ferguson pointed out that Britain counting out of as it was during the 19th century, exported 22 million people to create the whole modern world, Australia, Canada, etc., right? And, a place like Australia is mainly Irish.
Right.
So the point is they created they exported these people, and at the same time they solved the domestic problem of pauperism and industrial slums in Britain, and a big crime problem. It all got on boats and went away, and they became constructive people elsewhere. The U.S. has never been decent about the right of expatriation.
Yeah.
I have friends in London, I lived there a long time, who are told by their lawyers and tax advisors, never go to a function at the U.S. Embassy. The U.S. is always after you for taxes, God knows what else, even if you have never lived there, if you just have a U.S. passport. And they also, of course, the United States, if you try to renounce your citizenship here, you're given penal fines, you're prevented from re-entering the country. And even during the Second World War, there's a guy in my father's bomb crew who had expatriated himself to Canada and then to Britain to fight in the war. And when the U.S. got into the war, they drafted him as a private and said he was AWOL.
Oh.
And the point was, fortunately, there was a great New Hampshire governor named Wyatt, who was then the ambassador in London. He went and got to U.S. Embassy.
Oh, he did? Wow.
Yeah, and got to transfer from the Royal Air Force to the U.S. 8th Air Force at his existing rank.
Right.
But it took
Yeah.
an ambassador.
Well, I think that's a really great point, Kevin, because governments were always kind of strategic about when they would recognize expatriation and when they would not. And there's early on, there is no explicit law on expatriation in the United States until 1868 because they couldn't, agree upon it. And there was much more. You're right that when Americans are thinking about the right of the governments, think about the right of expatriation, they're always imagining people coming to them, right? And there is concern in the 18-teens and with the Mexican, as Americans start to go to Texas before and when it's Mexico, and they're not happy, that they're leaving and swearing allegiance to Mexico. And some judges will say, no, they can't leave. We don't have enough people here. We need people coming here.
And one of the things that's striking about the 1868 law is how it's worded. It doesn't say, it says, immigrants have a right to leave their countries and come to the United States. That's a natural right. It doesn't say explicitly whether the Americans have the right to renounce their citizenship. And one of the first things that President Grant does after he comes into office, and am I right? Well, anyway, soon after the law's passed, President Grant sends around a notice saying, "I need some advice. Are Americans covered by this?" And so it is strategic, and the British played that card too. Letting people go at some times and not at others. So it is very much strategically used. And I didn't know until I started doing this research. When I started looking at current expatriation, someone got in touch with me, and it was all about taxes. And I thought, well, so that's the new issue.
It's a reason.
Yes.
Lucy, you mentioned the congressional debates.
Yes.
Just before the act, and for a moment I could feel your pain as you just recalled how difficult it is to work through those sources and how to land it. But as you said that, I was wondering what those debates were about, because the level of immigration, people entering the country, you could say that expatriation is built into naturalization policy.
Right.
For some,
yeah.
right, on racial grounds from the beginning. So I've read through the same debates as you have for the 14th and 15th Amendment recently, and reading specifically on the lookout for questions concerning immigration and related questions of allegiance. So in addition to the core question of emancipation and slavery, what comes up consistently is three issues. One is, how will this affect the Chinese? Two is, how will it affect Native Americans? And three, as you may recall, bizarrely and interesting, is the threat posed by gypsies. Right, because the gypsy becomes the icon of movement, of naturalization, and somebody in the Senate says that he's heard more about gypsies in 1868 than he heard in his lifetime up to that point. But this is also, it's the year of the 14th Amendment, it's the year of the Birmingham Treaty, which recognizes the right to movement, the right to residency and rights, except for citizenship. So I just wondered, does it line up the same way in those debates?
Are they similar?
And what is the opposition to this principle? What are the fears that
to the opposition to recognizing the right?
Yeah, or it should, in one sense, it should be a no-brainer. In another sense, it intersects with so many issues that it's going to be a cause for alarm.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Well, the debate, the debate kind of is huge and ropes in all kinds of issues, as you suggested. And the other thing that was sort of interesting, and getting to write narrative history, where you have to what's the context, what's the environment like, and it was like a deadly heat wave, and one of the worst in generations. And Washington D.C., horses, they say, are dropping in the street. It's so hot, and so Congress in July is there trying to discuss this issue, and they're miserable. But nobody would say we don't believe in the right of expatriation, so no one's arguing with that necessarily. It is very much a party, it tends to follow on party lines, mostly. It is, interestingly, not the Republicans who are the architects of Reconstruction legislation. The Sumner leads the fight against it. And he's not saying we shouldn't recognize the right of expatriation. He's just saying this is a stupid bill. This is political grandstanding. He doesn't like the Fenians either. He just, he thinks it's a distraction from what the country really should be focusing on. He will, but he sees it really feeds into the divided party politics of the time, right? So he sees this as a Democratic Party initiative that is, as we see with the kind of racial arguments being made, there is a sense that race is very much a underlying, and not underlying, but sometimes a very explicit part of the debate. So there will be a lot of, it'll be similar. They're saying, like, why don't, Sumner doesn't care about white guys, he only cares about black guys. You know, there'll be that kind of talk. And then they'll turn it back on the Democrats. Well, what about the Chinese in California? You know, they're being treated as poorly, worse than African Americans in the South. So that is definitely at play in that debate. So there's party politics. There's also this is also when the impeachment of Andrew Johnson happened. So they start the debate, and the original bill does not declare that the people have a natural right to expatriate. So the immigrants hate it. The original bill is too hedged. And so a lot of the debate, before I get back to impeachment, a lot of the debate is about, well, should people really be able to get their citizenship? Anytime, where, you know, can they, do we really believe that? You know, so there's a lot of, like, what about, you know, what about if they owe money? Or what about if, you know, they're trying to ditch their obligations as a citizen? You know, there's a real sense that citizenship has weight. You can't just like be taking it on and off at your will. So there's that kind of discussion. So the first bill kind of dies, and they go back to try to redraft it, and then the Congress is absorbed with the impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. When they come back, a lot of the debate is about, well, who's going to enforce this? How do we enforce this right of expatriation, this natural right to leave? You know, so say Britain arrests another Irish American. What are you going to do about it? You know, that's when the hostage thing comes in. We'll have hostages. And Sumner's thinking, like, that's a silly way to run a country. You can't do that. But they're worried about too much, you know, who's going to be really in power? Is it Congress going to enforce it, or is it the president? And the Republicans really don't want to give any more power to the president. So it's just fraught with all kinds of things. And the Burlingame Treaty is also being decided at the same time. And that also features into the book. But yeah, hi.
When did countries begin allowing their citizens to take on a second citizenship?
Yeah, that's a great question. It varies, and some countries allow it today and some do not. The goal in the 19th century was, like, you know, everybody should have you only get married to one person, it should be monogamous, right? They always use those sorts of marriage analogies, you know, one country for every person. So people can be bigamous beginning in more recent years. That's been much more of a recent development. And the reasons for it are, you know, multiple. I mean, there are some countries like Mexico and Italy, you know, people who are trying to, and Ireland to some extent when did they start allowing it?
I think it's don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah, okay. Well, some have actively recruited their
I'm not sure.
their natives
Yeah.
to say, you know, fine, you want to go to America, fine, you can still be, you know, this. You know, that comes with my roommate who's Vincenzo Pantano. Her family's Italian, and when it became possible for children of Italians who immigrated to the United States to become a citizen, her brother said, oh, that's cool. I'd like to be a citizen of Italy and the United States. And then he got a call to military service from Italy. So it's, you know, I think that dual citizenship has its own barbs, right? You know, like you think, oh, it means I can travel and work in all these places. But as this period that I studied suggests, you know, we're talking about obligations. You know, you have protection, but you also have obligations. You have to pay taxes to serve in the military. But to go back to your question, you know, it's kind of a complicated question. The United States, for example, is sort of you have to renounce. Some countries make you renounce your previous allegiance. Yes.
At the age of 18, but I have UK, US, and I swore an allegiance to the Queen.
Yes.
But I would never give up. I want the Navy SEALs coming after me in Oman. I would never give up my US citizenship.
Yes.
But it's odd.
So you became a naturalized UK
I
citizen?
became a naturalized, and I voted against Brexit.
And you know why? it's because of the Fenians you're able to become a naturalized, because of the Naturalization Act of 1870 finally let people become naturalized more readily. But go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, so I was just wondering when the UK began allowing dual citizenship for its citizens.
You know, I'm not sure, and as Kevin suggests, a lot of it is, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You know, we're not gonna.
It's post-war.
Yeah, like 16.
Yeah.
Yes.
Most of
By the
these-
way, you're much better off with the SAS. They are much better military.
Yeah, so it's a country by country thing, and I think it's been much more of a recent development, and we'll see where it goes.
I think a key thing is the decline of conscription.
Yes.
When you used to have a draft here, you used to have national service in the UK well into the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a right, the hardest thing, I mean, taxes are taxes, but for instance, a lot of people I know had, like, I had a great next door neighbor, kids were born here
Yeah.
during the war. Her husband was a British admiral. Her sons lost their U.S. citizenship when they took the Queen's Commission.
Mm-hmm.
Until they joined the Army, they were U.S. citizens. The minute they took the Queen's Commission,
Well, except for there was, I mean, the Supreme Court said you can't do that because, I mean, the Supreme Court. The other thing that's developed is that the story in the 20th century is that expatriation becomes. We think of it as, I think of it in the 19th century as the right to choose. But in the 20th century, it becomes about losing citizenship. So a lot of it is, as the United States government is trying to decide, okay, so how do we know when someone's expatriated themselves? You know, that's the other big concern after this law is passed. Do you have to say, go before a court saying, I'm giving up my citizenship now? Or is it by acts? You know, if you go live somewhere, you go back to your native land, right? You maybe naturalized here, but then you go back to Armenia, for example. That's one of the big controversial places, and or you go Turkey, wherever you live there for 10 years, then the government says you've given up your American citizenship. Or if you serve in somebody else's military, or if you vote in an election. So the government, by World War II, had said all of these things. By your acts, you have demonstrated that you are renouncing your American citizenship. But the Supreme Court, in a series of cases, just started saying, "Well, no, citizenship becomes lifted up by the Supreme Court in a series of decisions in the mid-20th century, saying it is such a precious thing that you cannot assume somebody has decided to give it up unless there's really an explicit renunciation." So it's actually pretty hard to give up your American citizenship without really, really trying. And there's there are a couple of really good articles about how hard it is to legally renounce your allegiance in the United States now.
and then try coming and going.
Yes, and that's not.
Thank you so much for this talk. When I lived in Germany, I always found it very strange that I became an expat.
Yes.
Even though I was still an American citizen, but I joined an expat community. So thank you for explaining to me my forgotten right of expatriation. But I really love the context that you were giving us about how this fits into a global negotiation of sovereignty.
Right.
Especially since the Exclusion Act was really, they needed a treaty beforehand in order to pass the Exclusion Act.
Right.
And I was wondering if you can help us sort of contextualize what were the diplomatic conversations as a result of the 1868 Expatriation Act. Whether, it sounded, you gave us some clues that the U.S. had to negotiate treaties with individual countries, just like we have to negotiate them for deportation, right?
Right.
So what was sort of the diplomatic conversation going on in that moment?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Well, in some ways, the move towards the treaties are happening even before the Expatriation Act is passed. So what's kind of tricky about doing this project is that there are these strands, right? So there's the Fenian crisis, which gives a lot of publicity to this issue and helps mobilize the American the political forces at home on this issue. So they're one very visible group. But then there's this quieter group, the Francis Lieber that I showed you. And it's a group, and I kind of alluded to them before. So it's a group of activists, scholars, types, who are diplomats and they're international law scholars, and they see this period as just brimming with possibility, right? So you have a network. So, Lieber, Francis Lieber, he's Prussian American. He has this pen pal relationship with French and Swiss and English legal thinkers. And they're all talking about, we can build this most amazing new international commonwealth. He sees this this is when nation states are becoming formed, like Germany is unifying, Italy is unifying, the United States has gone through its own war for unification with the Civil War. And so he sees this as this golden moment where states are being reorganized and consolidated. And as they become modern nation states, they're going to become more alike, and we could have this international commonwealth, and we'll have a new international law that puts everybody on the same page, right? So that's one element of it. So this group is already talking to each other, and they don't care about the Fenians. They don't really care that much about migrants. They care about the free flow of people and goods and a classical liberal theory, and so they're on that, and liberty. They think that they're on that front, and they have a lot. And these guys have a lot of influence on diplomats. And so George Bancroft, the historian, even as Warren is going on trial, he's already on his way to Prussia. And he's negotiating with the Chancellor Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, to come up with a treaty that will, a naturalization treaty which will recognize the right of expatriation. So this is like they're working on parallel tracks and they're influenced by each other, but they're separate in some ways too. So Bancroft gets his treaty negotiated before the Expatriation Act is passed. And he trots it out thinking, this is going to be great. Now we'll have all these this will be the model. He runs into some difficulties for a variety of reasons because it's hedged. It's never as fully protected as advocates would like, right? And the Burlingame Treaty is another, people don't normally think of that as a naturalization treaty, but it has, it's negotiated at the same time, and it has the most full protection for expatriation. It says everybody has a natural right to leave their homes and to seek, to travel. What happens with that treaty, though, is it gets negotiated and it looks like a fabulous defense of the right of expatriation. It gets to the Senate, and the Senate says, well, does this mean that Chinese will be able to become naturalized citizens? And they put in a special clause in the Senate before ratification saying, this does not mean that Chinese will be able to naturalize. So the diplomatic conversations are, I don't know if that answers your question, but they work out differently in different states, in different countries, but the United States is really driving this because they realize that domestic law alone cannot, they're going to need treaties, like you said. They have to have treaties. They can't just pass a law and expect everybody other countries to respect it.
Just a question on the Chinese perspective.
Yeah.
And your book project. So your first book looked at the many ways Chinese immigrants challenged the Chinese exclusion laws in the United States. So I'm wondering about the pre-1882 period. To what extent does this piece of legislation, the Repatriation Act of 1868, to what extent does the Chinese community in the United States invoke that as part of their struggle against anti-Chinese advocates, over the debates over exclusion and inclusion? Because we often hear about the Birmingham Treaty, but this specific piece of legislation related to expatriation 1868. Is this something that the Chinese are frequently invoking in terms of advocating greater inclusion, the
Right.
right to stay in the United States, the right to migrate, particularly in the 1870s in the lead up to passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882?
I haven't seen that. I mean, it does get invoked, interestingly, in the Wong Kim Ark case, the U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark case, which is about whether children born of Chinese parents in the United States are going to be U.S. citizens or not under the 14th Amendment.
That's in 1898, right?
Yes, it's later, much later. And so you do have, in that case, the justices are referring back to the Expatriation Act of 1868 and writing their decisions. But I haven't seen, and it might be there, but I just can't recall seeing anything where they're explicitly referring to the Expatriation Act of Chinese litigants or activists themselves referring to it. And partly it's because so quickly that avenue seems to have been foreclosed, both by the Burlingame Treaty, which had that clause inserted, right, saying, we're not saying that Chinese can be naturalized. And in 1870 is when the United States reconsiders revises its Naturalization Act. Charles Sumner is trying to get Congress to take out the race requirement, and the Congress says no because we're worried about Chinese becoming citizens. So, and then, with the treaties and the acts. So I haven't seen explicit use, but it might be there.
I just want to make one observation, which something you said that really piqued my interest and reminded me of an article I read in the Times about the origin of the Trump family. The Times is
Yes.
to write these extensive articles, and I've just kind of thought about its lineage. Well, apparently Donald Trump's grandfather was a German-born immigrant, and he married a German-born woman here in New York. She became unhappy with life here, and they returned at her insistence to Germany, where they were confronted by the authorities who said, well, you didn't get a proper exit visa. You did not complete your military service. And if you want to stay here, you have to do that. And that led to the existence of our current president.
Yeah.
An interesting link.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I've been so fascinated by the conversation that I lost track of time. So I'm going to suggest that we transfer our allegiance